In order to understand the emergence and eventual divergence of Christianity from Judaism, it is essential first to examine the structure, practices, and institutions of Second Temple Judaism, which prevailed from 516 BC to 70 AD. By the 1st century AD, Judaism was not a monolithic system, but a constellation of religious practices, social norms, and sectarian affiliations, each interpreting the Torah, the prophetic texts, and the temple system in distinctive ways. These practices and divisions formed the environment into which Jesus of Nazareth was born and from which the earliest Christian movement would emerge. The Second Temple itself, rebuilt under Persian sponsorship in 516 BC and extensively renovated under Herod the Great, 37 to 4 BC, remained the central locus of Jewish religious life. It was both a ritual center for sacrifice and a symbol of collective identity, representing continuity with the covenantal obligations articulated in the Torah. Temple priests, drawn primarily from the Zadokite lineage, performed daily sacrifices, regulated festivals, and oversaw the maintenance of sacred spaces. The temple also functioned as a repository of legal and liturgical authority, where the Torah's instructions were interpreted, codified, and enforced for the population of Judea and beyond. The legal framework of Judaism was governed by Torah observance, which included not only the written law, but an emerging oral tradition. Rabbis and teachers, although formalized as a class only later, had begun developing interpretive frameworks, such as halakhic rulings, that guided everyday behavior. Daily religious life included ritual purity regulations, dietary restrictions, Sabbath observance, and the periodic performance of sacrifices at the temple. These practices were not uniform. Adherence varied by region, sect, and social class. Jewish society in this period was diverse, with several identifiable groups that interpreted law and prophecy differently. Pharisees. This group emphasized the interpretation and expansion of the Torah through oral tradition, known later as the oral law. They focused on ethical behavior, ritual purity, and observance in everyday life, seeking to apply religious law in ways that extended beyond the temple. Pharisaic influence extended into local synagogues and communities throughout Judea, Galilee, and beyond. Their interpretation of the law was accessible to the general population, not limited to the priestly class. Sadducees, predominantly associated with the temple priesthood and the elite, the Sadducees maintained the written Torah as the sole legal authority. They controlled temple administration, the collection of tithes, and the performance of sacrificial rituals. Unlike the Pharisees, they rejected oral traditions, emphasizing ritual precision and temple-centered authority. Politically, they were often aligned with the ruling elite and accommodated Roman governance to maintain their religious and social influence. Essenes, although primarily documented by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder, the Essenes were a separatist group that withdrew from mainstream society to maintain strict ritual purity and communal discipline. They resided in settlements such as Qumran near the Dead Sea, observed celibacy or regulated marriage, and emphasized apocalyptic expectation. They compiled and preserved texts, some of which survive in the Dead Sea Scrolls, reflecting their interpretation of law, prophecy, and ritual observance. Zealots, emerging in the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD, the Zealots were a political movement advocating armed resistance against Roman occupation. While not primarily a religious sect, Their understanding of Torah and covenantal obligation informed their political ideology. They operated mainly in Judea and formed the nucleus of opposition movements leading to the Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD. Other local and regional groups. In Galilee, Samaria, and Idumea, Jewish practices were influenced by local conditions, including economic roles, Hellenistic cultural exposure, and proximity to Gentile populations. These communities maintained basic adherence to temple worship and Torah observance, but could diverge in interpretations of purity, calendar, and ritual. In addition to internal diversity, Jewish life was shaped by external political control. Roman influence in Judea increased after 63 BC, when Pompey captured Jerusalem, converting the region into a client state and later a province. Herod the Great, 37 to 4 BC, ruled with Roman support, renovating the temple, suppressing political dissent, and balancing local Jewish expectations with imperial interests. Following Herod, Roman procurators such as Pontius Pilate, 26 to 36 AD, administered the region, exercising authority over taxation, public order, and capital punishment. Roman rule imposed constraints on religious autonomy, necessitating negotiation between religious authorities and imperial administration. The interplay of sectarian differences and Roman governance created a complex environment. Temple authorities, Pharisaic teachers, and local elders maintained social cohesion and religious observance while accommodating the Roman presence. Pilate's execution of perceived insurgents, including, historically, Jesus of Nazareth, exemplifies this dynamic. Roman political oversight intersecting with Jewish religious authority to enforce both law and order. Messianic expectation was another salient feature of this period. Many Jews anticipated the arrival of a figure, the Messiah, who would restore the kingdom of Israel, purify the temple, and implement justice according to covenantal law. These expectations were grounded in prophetic texts such as Isaiah, Daniel, and the Psalms. However, messianic concepts were diverse. Some envisioned a priestly or prophetic figure. Others anticipated a Davidic king. The historical record, including writings of Josephus, demonstrates that multiple claimants to messianic authority arose in this period, sometimes provoking Roman intervention. Synagogues supplemented the temple as centers of learning and local worship, particularly in Galilee and the diaspora. They facilitated Torah reading, instruction, and communal gathering, and provided a locus for the diffusion of Jewish teachings to populations distant from Jerusalem. The combination of temple and synagogue created a dual framework: centralized ritual observance at the temple and decentralized study, prayer, and interpretation at synagogues. Economically and socially, the Jewish population was stratified. Urban centers such as Jerusalem, Sepphoris, and Tiberias housed elites, merchants, and temple officials. Rural villages, such as Nazareth, consisted of subsistence farmers, artisans, and laborers. Hellenistic influence penetrated trade, language, and urban life, contributing to cultural diversity within the population. Greek language and coinage circulated alongside Aramaic and Hebrew texts, facilitating communication and commerce. Legal authority was divided. Roman governors and procurators exercised ultimate power, including taxation and capital punishment. The Sanhedrin, an assembly of priests, elders, and scribes, adjudicated religious and civil disputes, particularly those not involving capital crimes. The Pharisees exerted influence through teaching and local judicial authority, while the Sadducees dominated the temple and ceremonial law. This legal and social framework ensured that Judaism in the early 1st century AD was a structured, codified, and highly organized system, capable of adaptation to local and imperial conditions. During this period, textual production and preservation were active. The Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, was largely compiled, with textual standardization underway. The Septuagint translation of the Torah into Greek had circulated in diaspora communities, particularly in Alexandria, supporting Jewish literacy outside Judea. Other writings, pseudepigrapha, sectarian texts, and commentary, reflected ongoing debate and interpretation. These textual traditions formed the basis for later disputes and teachings within early Christian writings, which frequently referenced or interpreted these Jewish texts. By the turn of the 1st century AD, therefore, Judaism was characterized by temple-centered sacrificial worship, sectarian diversity among Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and others, synagogue-based study and worship, codified law with emerging oral tradition, political negotiation with Roman authorities, social stratification and regional variation, messianic expectation and prophetic interpretation. Into this environment, Jesus of Nazareth was born. His ministry, beginning around 27 to 30 AD, would engage with these institutions, texts, and practices. Understanding the complexity of this Jewish milieu is essential. Early Christian movements arose not in isolation, but within this structured, variegated religious landscape. The divergence that would occur between Judaism and the Jesus movement cannot be understood without recognizing the legal, ritual, sectarian, and political contours of 1st century Judaism. Jesus was a Jewish teacher who emerged in Galilee during the early 1st century AD, a region characterized by Jewish populations under Roman provincial oversight. Roman authority was represented locally through officials such as Herod Antipas, who ruled Galilee as tetrarch from 4 BC to 39 AD. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD, maintained authority over Jerusalem and exercised power over legal and capital matters. Jesus' ministry began approximately between 27 AD and 30 AD. Historical accounts situate his early activity in Jewish towns such as Nazareth, Capernaum, and Bethsaida. His activity focused on Jewish communities and synagogues, engaging with existing practices of Torah reading, interpretation, and ethical instruction. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that synagogues functioned as centers for local instruction and communal worship, and this was the context in which Jesus' teachings were delivered. The content of Jesus' teaching, as documented in early Christian letters, notably the letters of Paul, though written after his death, emphasized adherence to the Torah and fulfillment of Jewish prophetic traditions. His interpretation engaged with the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, particularly the Law of Moses and the writings of the prophets. Teachings on ethics, ritual observance, and social conduct reflect continuity with Jewish norms while presenting specific interpretations that distinguished his approach within the Jewish milieu. Jesus' followers during his ministry were almost entirely Jewish. Historical reconstructions suggest a group of male and female adherents who traveled with him and participated in ritual and communal life. Their activities included attending the temple in Jerusalem for major festivals, observing the Sabbath, and participating in the agricultural and communal economy of Galilee. Contemporary Jewish law required ritual purity and observance of prescribed festivals and sacrifices, which would have structured the daily life of these followers. The historical record indicates that Jesus' movement did not initially establish separate religious institutions. No independent ecclesiastical structures are documented before his death. Gatherings occurred in private homes, open spaces, or synagogues, which were consistent with Jewish religious practices of the period. These gatherings were centered on the teaching of Torah, interpretation of prophecy, and discussions regarding the role of the Messiah. The designation Messiah, Hebrew, Mashiach, referred to an expected deliverer of Israel, and the notion was diverse among Jews at the time, including expectations of priestly, prophetic, or royal fulfillment. Interactions with Jewish sects are recorded in both early Christian texts and references in Josephus. Jesus engaged with Pharisaic and Sadducean interpretations, often in public discussions. The Pharisees emphasized oral law, ethical conduct, and ritual purity, while the Sadducees controlled the temple and the sacrificial system. Engagement with these groups, including debates over the interpretation of Torah law, reflects that Jesus' ministry operated within established Jewish frameworks rather than outside them. During his ministry, Jesus traveled across Galilee and occasionally to Judea. Evidence from historical records indicates his presence in Jerusalem, particularly during major Jewish festivals, where crowds and local authorities documented his activities. The Roman historian Tacitus does not record his life directly, but references later Christian communities, confirming the historical existence of a movement that arose in Judea in the early 1st century AD. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century AD, references Jesus as a historical figure who was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, 14 to 37 AD. While some later interpolations in Josephus are disputed, there is a broad scholarly consensus that these references preserve the basic historical fact of his execution. The method of execution, crucifixion, was a Roman administrative practice reserved for insurrectionists, slaves, and individuals deemed threats to public order. This aligns with historical accounts placing Jesus' death under Roman authority, with the involvement of Jewish temple authorities for matters of local concern. The documented date for the crucifixion is generally placed between 30 AD and 33 AD, based on the correlation of historical calendars, accounts of Passover, and Roman administrative records. The crucifixion of Jesus became the pivotal event for his followers. The letters of Paul, written in the 50s AD, indicate that early followers understood this event as central to the movement, but during his lifetime, followers continued to operate within Jewish practice. Archaeological evidence from Galilee suggests that 1st century Jewish groups maintained ritual observance, including meals, prayer, and festivals, which would have included the Jesus movement before any doctrinal separation. While historical sources confirm that Jesus' teachings and actions generated attention, they do not support narratives of miraculous interventions. Roman records, Jewish historical texts, and early letters emphasize his role as a Jewish teacher and the subsequent activities of his followers. The movement remained within the Jewish religious framework, observing Sabbath, dietary law, and temple rituals. Early followers did not initially separate themselves in terms of ritual or institutional authority. They continued to attend synagogues, offer sacrifices at the temple, and observe the Jewish calendar. The divergence from Judaism only became historically documented after his death, with letters and texts indicating theological debates over law, inclusion of Gentiles, and messianic interpretation. Regional and social distribution of followers was predominantly Galilean, but Jewish communities in Judea and the broader diaspora also began to engage. Textual evidence indicates that followers communicated through letters, itinerant teachers, and oral instruction. Early Christian texts, while written decades later, reference the activities of individuals who were contemporaneous with Jesus, reflecting continuity of practice within Jewish norms. By 33 AD, the documented elements of the movement included a core group of Jewish followers operating within Galilee and Judea, engagement with existing Jewish law and synagogue practice, attendance at the temple in Jerusalem during festivals, the recognition of Jesus as Messiah within the group, but not as a separate religion by outside observers, documentation of teachings through oral instruction and early written letters, which would later inform canonical texts. No independent worship structures, priesthood, or legal systems distinct from Judaism are documented for this period. The movement was a Jewish sectarian development, emphasizing the interpretation and fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. Historical continuity is maintained in the records. Roman authorities recognized these individuals as part of the Jewish population, and Jewish authorities did not categorize them as a separate religious group before 33 AD. The historical context of Galilee and Judea under Roman administration also provides insight into the social and political environment in which this movement arose. The Roman census under Quirinius, 6 AD, ongoing taxation, and Herodian governance created tensions that are documented in Josephus and corroborated through archaeological inscriptions. These tensions shaped the environment for itinerant teachers like Jesus and for groups organizing around new interpretations of law and prophecy, without creating a formal separation from Judaism at this stage. Following the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, historically placed between 30 to 33 AD, represents the earliest phase in which the movement he inspired began to evolve in ways that would eventually distinguish it from mainstream Judaism. Historical sources for this period include letters of Paul, early Christian writings, such as the epistles predating the canonical Gospels, and references by Jewish and Roman historians, including Josephus and later Tacitus. Archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and communal records provide additional context regarding practices, locations, and the social integration of early followers. Immediately following the execution of Jesus by crucifixion under Roman authority, his Jewish followers maintained their traditional religious observances. These included temple worship in Jerusalem, attendance at synagogue services, observance of the Sabbath, and adherence to dietary laws. Textual evidence, including Paul's letters, e.g., Galatians, 1 Corinthians, indicates that the earliest followers continued to see themselves as Jews fulfilling the covenantal law, while also asserting belief in Jesus as the Messiah. No evidence exists of fully separate institutions or alternative religious hierarchies at this stage. Early gatherings took place in private homes or synagogues, consistent with Jewish communal norms. The earliest documented divergences occurred through interpretive and doctrinal discussions within these Jewish communities. Central issues included the role of the Torah for Gentile converts, the significance of Jesus' death, and the nature of messianic fulfillment. Paul's letters, written between 49 to 57 AD, provide the most detailed contemporary accounts of these debates. Paul argued that adherence to certain Jewish ceremonial laws, circumcision, dietary restrictions, and observance of festival regulations was not mandatory for Gentile converts. His letters, preserved in 1 Thessalonians c. 50 AD, Galatians c. 49 to 50 AD, and other epistles, document a tension between Jewish Christians who maintained full Torah observance and those advocating broader inclusion of non-Jews without full legal requirements. These letters represent the earliest textual evidence of doctrinal divergence, although the movement remained Jewish in origin and identity. Geographically, the post-crucifixion movement spread rapidly within Judea, Galilee, and the broader Eastern Mediterranean. Jerusalem remained a central hub, with key figures such as James, the brother of Jesus, documented as leading the Jerusalem community. The Acts of the Apostles, although written later, preserves early traditions of leadership structures in Jerusalem, including assemblies that functioned to maintain teaching, resolve disputes, and organize communal charity. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of small household gatherings, often in urban centers, which served as the primary venues for instruction, ritual meals, and social support. The expansion beyond Jewish communities introduced new dynamics. Paul's missionary journeys to regions such as Asia Minor, Cyprus, and Greece, documented in his letters and corroborated by later accounts, engaged predominantly Gentile populations. Historical evidence indicates that these early missions occurred between 46 to 50 AD, although precise dating is approximate. Roman records, inscriptions, and archaeological findings in Corinth, Ephesus, and Philippi demonstrate the presence of Jewish diasporic communities, which served as initial points of contact. These communities provided a framework for organizing religious gatherings, yet Gentile participation necessitated interpretive adjustments regarding the law and ritual practice. The debates over law and identity during this period were crystallized at the Council of Jerusalem, approximately 49 AD. Early Christian sources, including the account in Acts 15 and references in Galatians 2, document a meeting of leaders to determine requirements for Gentile converts. The council decided that full adherence to the Mosaic Law was not required for inclusion in the movement, although ethical and moral conduct consistent with Jewish law remained expected. This decision marks a significant historical point. The formal recognition that the Jesus movement was beginning to establish practices that diverged from mainstream Judaism while still acknowledging its roots. Temple access and ritual observance remained central for Jewish Christians during the early post-crucifixion decades. Followers continued to participate in major festivals, including Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, maintaining continuity with Jewish calendrical and liturgical systems. References in Paul's letters and later historical accounts confirm that Jerusalem remained a focal point for pilgrimage, teaching, and community oversight. Nonetheless, tensions with other Jewish authorities grew, particularly concerning the acceptance of Gentiles and the reinterpretation of messianic prophecies. These tensions were documented in textual evidence, including polemical writings preserved in epistles, but no independent Roman classification of Christians had yet fully differentiated them from Jews. The socio-political environment influenced these developments. Roman procurators, including Pontius Pilate before 36 AD and his successors, monitored the region for potential insurrection or civil disorder. Records of disturbances, such as those documented in Josephus' Jewish Antiquities, demonstrate that Jewish groups and factions were under close surveillance. The early Jesus movement, while primarily religious in focus, was part of this broader landscape of sectarian diversity. Roman administrative records suggest limited attention to these groups at this stage, classifying them broadly as Jews. Only later would the term Christian emerge in Roman records as a distinct identifier, reflecting recognition of divergence. Documentation from this period also highlights the role of textual transmission and early letters. Paul's epistles, written within 2 decades of Jesus' crucifixion, were circulated among communities to establish teaching, resolve disputes, and provide organizational guidance. These letters emphasize continuity with Jewish scripture, including citations from the Torah and the prophets, while also articulating theological interpretations that eventually distinguished the movement. The letters themselves constitute primary evidence for the doctrinal trajectory of the early Jesus movement and its interaction with Jewish law. Archaeological evidence from Galilee and Judea, including household inscriptions, ossuaries, and synagogues, supports the presence of small, organized gatherings adhering to Jewish ritual while incorporating belief in Jesus as Messiah. Excavations at sites such as Capernaum and Magdala reveal structures compatible with communal meals and instruction, consistent with textual descriptions of early Christian gatherings. This material culture reinforces the understanding that post-crucifixion followers maintained Jewish religious practice while developing distinctive organizational and interpretive frameworks. By approximately 50 AD, several key developments characterized the movement. Expansion beyond Galilee and Judea into the broader Eastern Mediterranean. Inclusion of Gentile followers, with formal decisions regarding Torah observance. Maintenance of Jewish rituals and temple attendance by Jewish members. Circulation of letters establishing doctrinal positions and resolving communal disputes. Growing distinction from other Jewish sects based on acceptance of Gentiles and reinterpretation of messianic fulfillment. These historical developments, documented in primary letters, Roman administrative references, and archaeological evidence, established the foundation for the subsequent separation between Judaism and the Jesus movement. By the mid-1st century, the movement remained rooted in Jewish practice, yet structural, doctrinal, and demographic changes were setting the stage for a distinct identity. The cumulative effect of missionary activity, leadership decisions, and textual production demonstrates an evolution from a reformist Jewish sect toward a broader religious community, without reliance on myth, legend, or retrospective theological interpretation. Between 50 to 70 AD represents a decisive stage in the historical divergence of Christianity from Judaism. Documented sources, including letters of Paul, other early epistolary evidence, Roman administrative records, Jewish historical accounts, such as Josephus' Jewish Antiquities and the Jewish War, and archaeological evidence indicate that the Jesus movement, originally a Jewish sect, underwent substantial structural, doctrinal, and demographic transformations during these decades. These developments occurred within the broader context of Roman provincial governance, increasing Gentile participation and mounting social and political pressures that would culminate in the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. By 50 AD, the movement founded by Jesus had already expanded beyond Galilee and Judea into the broader Eastern Mediterranean. Paul's epistolary correspondence demonstrates an extensive network of communities in Asia Minor, Greece, and Cyprus, including Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, and Thessalonica. These letters, composed between approximately 50 to 57 AD, indicate the existence of structured gatherings, doctrinal instruction, and communal regulation. Historical reconstruction shows that Paul functioned as a missionary, organizer, and doctrinal clarifier, operating alongside other leaders who maintained connections with the Jerusalem community, such as James, Peter, and John. The letters themselves provide primary evidence of disputes over observance of Jewish law, especially concerning Gentile converts, and the administrative mechanisms used to coordinate multiple communities. Gentile inclusion introduced key points of divergence from Jewish practice. While Jewish Christians continued to observe Torah requirements, Gentile converts were increasingly exempted from circumcision, dietary restrictions, and temple-based sacrifices, a position affirmed at the Council of Jerusalem circa 49 AD, Acts 15, Galatians 2. This decision, documented in primary epistolary sources, represents the first formal, historically attested divergence in practice between the movement and mainstream Judaism. It established the precedent that belief in Jesus' messiahship, rather than strict adherence to the Mosaic law, could serve as the criterion for inclusion. This created an institutional distinction, as Gentile communities organized around leaders such as Paul and local elders, rather than temple authorities. The expansion into Gentile regions necessitated adaptations in ritual and communal structure. Early Christian communities maintained assemblies for teaching, communal meals, and the collection of funds for Jerusalem, as documented in 1 Corinthians 16 verses 1 to 4. While these practices derived from Jewish synagogue and household assembly traditions, they increasingly developed distinctive characteristics, such as a ritualized meal commemorating Jesus' death, the earliest form of the Eucharist. These gatherings, documented in epistles, reveal an emerging communal identity that was distinct from the synagogue while remaining rooted in Jewish liturgical forms. Social and political pressures under Roman occupation significantly influenced institutional development. Judea, under procurators such as Antonius Felix, 52 to 60 AD, and Porcius Festus, 59 to 62 AD, experienced unrest due to taxation, local insurrections, and sectarian conflict. Josephus documents multiple rebellions, including localized revolts in Galilee, that reflect a tense environment in which Jewish sects, including the Jesus movement, operated. Archaeological evidence, such as fortified settlements and inscriptions, indicates that communities were aware of Roman authority and adjusted organizational and leadership structures accordingly. The Jesus movement, while primarily religious, had to navigate these pressures, often by maintaining low-profile assemblies and decentralized leadership in areas with significant Gentile populations. The period also witnessed growing theological codification. Epistolary evidence and early gospel traditions indicate that teachings about Jesus' death, resurrection, and role as Messiah were increasingly formalized. Paul's letters, written before the composition of the canonical Gospels, document interpretations of these events that emphasized faith, salvation, and the universality of the movement, independent of full Jewish ritual observance. These doctrinal developments were necessary to integrate Gentile converts while maintaining a coherent theological identity. They further distinguished the movement from Judaism, in which temple ritual, Torah observance, and Pharisaic interpretation remained central. Jerusalem remained a focal point for Jewish Christians. Archaeological evidence, combined with textual documentation, indicates the continued operation of a leadership council in the city, presided over by James, the brother of Jesus. This leadership coordinated charity, dispute resolution, and communication among distant communities. Yet, as Gentile communities grew, the influence of Jerusalem diminished in practical terms for doctrinal and organizational matters, creating a dual structure: Jewish-centered authority in Jerusalem and autonomous Gentile communities with local leadership. Tensions with Jewish authorities increased during this period. Josephus documents disputes among sects over adherence to the law, ritual authority, and messianic claims. While early Jewish Christians were initially tolerated, the expansion of Gentile-oriented practices and reinterpretation of messianic prophecy drew the attention of both religious and political authorities. Historical evidence suggests that these tensions were largely administrative and ritual-based, rather than violent at first. Roman records do not classify Christians as a separate religious group until later. At this stage, they were still largely categorized as a Jewish sect, although internal differentiation was underway. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD by Roman legions under Titus was a historically decisive event. Josephus, the Jewish War, provides detailed accounts of the siege, including the destruction of the sanctuary, the loss of the priesthood's central authority, and the dispersal of the Jewish population. For mainstream Judaism, this event necessitated a reorganization. Rabbinic authority became central, synagogue-based worship replaced temple ritual, and the codification of the Torah and oral law gained primacy. For the Jesus movement, the temple's destruction reinforced the distinction from Judaism. Communities outside Judea, particularly Gentile communities, already practiced worship independent of the temple. The temple's loss accelerated the institutional divergence, as Judaism reorganized around remaining Jewish communities, while Christianity increasingly centered on local assemblies, episcopal leadership, and communal practices no longer tied to the temple. By 70 AD, Historical sources indicate several defining characteristics of the emerging Christian identity: institutional independence from temple-centered authority. Gentile communities functioned autonomously, guided by elders and itinerant teachers. Distinctive ritual practice. The Eucharist and baptism were formalized practices differing from Jewish sacrificial systems. Expanded membership. Gentile converts formed a substantial proportion of the movement, altering communal demographics. Textual codification. Epistolary evidence, circulating letters, and early oral traditions created a coherent doctrinal framework. Recognition of divergence. Although still broadly classified as Jews and Roman administrative terms, internal structures and theological positions reflected an increasingly separate identity. Archaeological evidence supports these conclusions. Inscriptions, household remains, and gathering spaces across Asia Minor and Greece indicate communal organization and ritual activity consistent with early Christian practices. Textual evidence from Paul and other epistolary sources confirms coordination across distant communities, the collection of funds, and the resolution of doctrinal disputes. These developments document an emergent religion with roots in Judaism, but growing institutional, doctrinal, and demographic distinctions. From 70 AD to 100 AD represents a critical stage in the historical formation of Christianity as a distinct religious entity separate from Judaism. Historical sources for this period include early Christian texts such as the Pauline epistles, letters of other early leaders, the earliest gospel traditions, and external references by Roman historians, including Tacitus and Suetonius, as well as Jewish historical sources such as Josephus. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions, house churches, and synagogues, provides material context for understanding the institutional, doctrinal, and communal transformations that took place. This period follows the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, a historically documented event that restructured Jewish religious life and indirectly accelerated the divergence of Christianity. The destruction of the temple by Roman forces under Titus eliminated the central locus of sacrificial worship and priestly authority in Judaism. Josephus' account in the Jewish War, Book 6, provides detailed documentation of the siege, the burning of the temple, and the dispersal of the priestly class. In the aftermath, Jewish religious authority shifted decisively toward rabbinic leadership and synagogue-centered practice. Rabbis codified Torah interpretation, emphasized oral traditions, and reorganized community life around study and prayer rather than temple sacrifice. These developments are historically attested through rabbinic texts compiled later, but based on early first-century traditions, such as the Mishnah, which preserved post-temple legal and ritual practices. In contrast, Christian communities increasingly consolidated practices that were independent of the temple. By 70 AD, gatherings of followers occurred in urban centers such as Rome, Antioch, Ephesus, and Corinth, as well as in rural regions across Asia Minor. Archaeological evidence, including domestic structures identified as house churches, demonstrates that worship and communal meals were conducted in private homes or communal halls. The practice of baptism, ritual meals, e.g., the Eucharist, and regular instruction in Jesus' teachings became institutionalized. Epistolary evidence from Paul, including 1 Corinthians, Romans, and Philippians, documents organizational structures such as local elders, presbyters, and itinerant teachers responsible for maintaining doctrine, resolving disputes, and overseeing communal life. Leadership within early Christian communities became formalized. Texts indicate the appointment of elders in cities and towns to manage local assemblies, provide instruction, and ensure adherence to ethical and doctrinal norms. The authority of the Jerusalem leadership, previously central, diminished in practical terms due to the geographic spread of communities and the growing Gentile membership. Letters from Paul document ongoing communication with Jerusalem, e.g., collection for the poor in Judea, but local governance increasingly relied on autonomous leadership structures. This historical development marks a decisive divergence from Jewish communal organization, which remained centered on synagogues, rabbinic instruction, and temple oversight where possible. The integration of Gentile converts continued to define Christian distinctiveness. Paul's letters, written between 50 to 64 AD and still influential in this period, outline the incorporation of non-Jews into communities without the requirement of full Torah observance. Gentiles adopted baptism and participation in communal meals as central rituals, distinguishing them from Jewish sacrificial and festival obligations. The epistolary records emphasize faith in Jesus as the central criterion for inclusion rather than adherence to the Mosaic Law. This theological and practical differentiation is historically documented as the basis for the early perception of Christians as a separate group, even while Roman authorities initially categorized them broadly as Jews. Textual developments during 70 to 100 AD further reinforced identity consolidation. While the earliest letters predate the canonical Gospels, oral traditions about Jesus' life and teachings circulated widely and were increasingly codified. References in later texts indicate that these narratives provided ethical instruction, communal guidance, and doctrinal clarity. The canonical Gospels, though composed in the later part of the 1st century, reflect these early traditions, demonstrating continuity of teaching and interpretation from the immediate post-crucifixion period. The collection and dissemination of these texts contributed to cohesion among geographically dispersed communities and reinforced boundaries between Christians and other Jewish sections. The Roman context also shaped Christian consolidation. Tacitus, in Annals c. 116 AD, referencing earlier events, notes that Christians were distinct from Jews by the early 1st century, already recognized by Roman authorities as a separate group responsible for particular communal activities. While this recognition postdates 100 AD, it is historically grounded in the practices and structures established between 70 to 100 AD, including autonomous communities, ritualized gatherings, and identifiable leadership. Archaeological inscriptions in Asia Minor, dated to the late 1st century, confirm the presence of communities referring to themselves with terms distinguishable from Jewish designations. Christian worship practices in this period became increasingly standardized. The ritual of baptism, administered in local water sources or constructed basins, served as the primary rite of initiation. Communal meals commemorating the death of Jesus, Eucharist, were conducted regularly and incorporated readings from Hebrew scriptures alongside apostolic teaching. Prayer and instruction in moral and ethical conduct were integral to gatherings, documented both in epistles and in later gospel traditions. These practices were distinct from synagogue worship, which continued to center on Torah reading, prayer, and festivals, reflecting the clear institutional differentiation that historians recognize. Communal identity was reinforced by doctrinal codification. Pauline letters, as primary sources, document issues of ethics, leadership, and theological interpretation. Texts address disputes regarding dietary laws, marital conduct, and observance of Jewish holidays, reflecting early Christian attempts to establish norms independent of Jewish legal structures. The letters also articulate theological positions concerning the death and resurrection of Jesus, the universality of salvation, and the role of faith, which form the basis for communal coherence across diverse geographic locations. These doctrinal positions, while rooted in Jewish scripture, diverged from contemporary Jewish interpretation and practice. By the end of the 1st century AD, Christianity exhibited several historically documented markers of distinct religious identity. Institutional structures. Local elders and itinerant teachers managed communities across multiple regions, independent of temple or synagogue authority. Ritual practices, baptism, communal meals, and prayer assemblies were codified as primary religious observances. Textual codification, letters, oral traditions, and early gospel narratives circulated, providing consistent teaching and ethical guidance. Demographic composition. Gentile converts formed a significant portion of the population, shaping practice and organizational norms. Recognition of distinct identity. By the end of the 1st century, both Jewish and Roman observers increasingly perceived Christians as separate from Judaism, even if formal Roman classification would follow in subsequent decades. Meanwhile, Judaism reorganized around rabbinic authority. Synagogues became the primary centers of instruction and worship, preserving Torah observance, ritual law, and ethical instruction in the absence of the temple. The priesthood's centrality diminished, while scribes and teachers codified oral law, resulting in the foundations of what later became rabbinic Judaism. This historical development is well documented in rabbinic texts, supplemented by archaeological findings of synagogues and inscriptions indicating communal leadership structures. The contrast between the two trajectories became increasingly clear. Christianity, while retaining Jewish scripture and heritage, operated independently with its own leadership, ritual practices, and doctrinal focus. Judaism, in turn, consolidated around the Torah, rabbinic authority, and synagogue worship, preserving continuity of law and ritual within a restructured institutional framework. By 100 AD, the divergence was complete in historical terms. Two distinct religious entities, sharing origins in 1st century Judea, but differing in institutional, doctrinal, and social practice. External references corroborate this historical separation. Roman historians such as Suetonius and Tacitus, along with later Jewish sources, document the perception of Christians as a group distinct from Jews, even in locations far from Judea. Archaeological evidence of communal assemblies, inscriptions, and burial practices further demonstrates that Christianity had established identifiable communities with distinctive rites, leadership structures, and social cohesion. These markers of identity reflect developments initiated immediately after the crucifixion and accelerated by the destruction of the temple, culminating in a clear and documented divergence by the close of the 1st century. From 30 AD, the approximate year of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, to 100 AD, represents a historically documented trajectory in which Christianity evolved from a Jewish sect into a distinct religious tradition. Historical sources for this conclusion include the letters of Paul and other early Christian correspondence, later gospel accounts based on contemporaneous oral traditions. Jewish historians, such as Josephus, Roman historians, including Tacitus and Suetonius, and archaeological evidence from domestic and communal sites across Judea, Galilee, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This segment synthesizes the developments of the preceding phases, highlighting the institutional, doctrinal, and social differentiation that established Christianity and Judaism as separate entities by the end of the 1st century. Following the crucifixion of Jesus between 30 to 33 AD, Jewish followers initially continued participation in traditional Jewish religious practice. Archaeological evidence from Galilean towns such as Capernaum and Magdala, as well as textual references in early Christian letters, indicate that these followers observed Torah law, attended synagogue services, participated in temple festivals, and maintained ritual purity in accordance with Jewish law. Paul's letters, written between 49 to 57 AD, described communities that adhered to Jewish ethical standards while also teaching about Jesus as Messiah. During this period, there were no independent ecclesiastical structures separate from Jewish communal institutions. Gatherings occurred primarily in homes or synagogues, reflecting continuity with Jewish practice. The earliest documented divergences emerged primarily through debates over law, inclusion of Gentiles, and the theological significance of Jesus' crucifixion. The Council of Jerusalem, around 49 AD, represents the first historically attested organizational decision establishing that Gentile converts could join without full adherence to the Mosaic Law, including circumcision and dietary restrictions. This event, preserved in Acts 15 and referenced in Galatians 2, is a pivotal historical marker of divergence, creating a precedent for distinct practices and governance structures that separated Gentile Christians from Jewish law observance. Paul's letters, which circulated widely among early communities, document both doctrinal clarification and administrative oversight during this transitional phase. From 50 to 70 AD, the movement expanded geographically beyond Judea and Galilee, with communities established in Asia Minor, Greece, and Cyprus. Archaeological evidence from house churches, inscriptions, and communal gathering sites demonstrates the growth of decentralized communities with local leadership. Epistolary correspondence from Paul and other early leaders illustrates organizational structures, including elders, presbyters, and itinerant teachers, along with guidance on ethical conduct, ritual observance, and community cohesion. These communities incorporated Gentile members extensively, creating demographic changes that necessitated doctrinal clarification and institutional adaptation. Historical records indicate that these communities maintained continuity with Jewish scripture while establishing independent rituals such as baptism and communal meals commemorating Jesus' death. The destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, documented by Josephus in the Jewish War, was a decisive event for both Judaism and the Jesus movement. For Judaism, the elimination of the temple's centralized religious authority around rabbinic leadership codified Torah study and reinforced synagogue-based worship. For the Jesus movement, the temple's destruction accelerated institutional independence. Communities outside Judea, particularly Gentile-majority assemblies, already practiced worship without reliance on temple rituals, and post-70 AD practices such as house assemblies, prayer, and ritual meals became normative. This historical event crystallized the physical and structural separation of the two traditions as Jewish communities reorganized around remaining legal and liturgical frameworks, while Christian communities maintained autonomous religious structures. Between 70 to 100 AD, Christianity consolidated its identity through institutional organization, doctrinal codification, and ritual standardization. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and remnants of early house churches in Asia Minor and Rome, confirms the existence of structured communities guided by elders and itinerant teachers. Epistolary evidence and early gospel traditions document uniform teachings on faith in Jesus, moral conduct, and the significance of his death and resurrection. Ritual practices such as baptism, the Eucharist, and communal prayer became codified, creating identifiable markers of religious identity distinct from Judaism. Gentile inclusion was widespread, and communities functioned independently of the Jerusalem leadership, although communication and coordination continued through letters and emissaries. Simultaneously, Judaism solidified post-temple structures. Synagogue worship, rabbinic teaching, and Torah codification ensured continuity of law and practice. Jewish communities focused on scriptural study, observance of festivals, ethical instruction, and communal organization under rabbinic authority. The absence of the temple required adaptation of sacrificial and ritual systems, resulting in a legal and liturgical framework capable of sustaining Jewish religious identity under Roman oversight. The codification of oral traditions, later preserved in the Mishnah and other texts, preserved continuity with first-century practice and provided a foundation for post-temple Jewish law. By 100 AD, the historical record demonstrates a clear divergence between Christianity and Judaism. Christianity had established institutional independence, local elders, communal oversight, and autonomous governance structures. Codified ritual practices, baptism, the Eucharist, prayer assemblies, and structured teaching. Doctrinal distinctiveness, emphasis on Jesus as Messiah, inclusion of Gentiles without full Torah observance, and theological interpretations preserved in epistles. Demographic breadth, communities encompassing both Jewish and Gentile members across multiple regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. Recognition as distinct, historical references by Roman and later Jewish sources increasingly acknowledged Christianity as separate from mainstream Judaism. Christianity maintained historical continuity with Jewish scripture, including the Torah and prophetic writings, but its practices, governance, and doctrinal interpretations increasingly diverged. Jewish authorities, in contrast, reorganized religious life around the Torah, synagogues, and rabbinic leadership, preserving ritual and ethical continuity without reference to Jesus' messianic role. Archaeological, epistolary, and historical evidence together establish that by the end of the 1st century AD, the two traditions, while sharing origins in 1st century Judea, had emerged as historically distinct religions. The Roman historical record provides additional corroboration. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century AD, but referencing events of the late 1st century, distinguishes Christians from Jews, noting their presence in Rome and other parts of the empire. Suetonius likewise references the activities of Christians under imperial oversight. These accounts, while external, are consistent with internal epistolary evidence documenting autonomous communities, distinctive leadership, and ritual practices. They confirm that by the end of the 1st century AD, Christianity had established an identity recognized outside of its original Jewish context. Textual evidence further reinforces this divergence. Pauline epistles, letters from other early Christian leaders, and early gospel traditions document practices and teachings that are historically verifiable. instruction on moral and ethical conduct, communal meals, baptismal rites, and interpretation of Hebrew scripture in light of Jesus' life and death. Gentile inclusion, the decentralization of leadership, and the creation of new ritual forms mark clear departures from Jewish practice. Archaeological and epistolary data confirm that these developments occurred in multiple regions simultaneously, demonstrating that divergence was widespread and not confined to isolated communities. In conclusion, the historical trajectory from 30 AD to 100 AD demonstrates the emergence of Christianity as a distinct religious entity, while Judaism reorganized and codified itself following the destruction of the Second Temple. Christianity retained Jewish scriptural heritage but developed independent leadership, codified rituals, and doctrinal positions emphasizing Jesus as Messiah and the inclusion of Gentiles. Judaism maintained continuity with the Torah and rabbinic authority, centering religious life on synagogues and codified law. By 100 AD, historical evidence, including letters, contemporary writings, Roman records, and archaeological findings, confirms that the divergence between Christianity and Judaism was complete in terms of institutional structure, ritual practice, doctrine, and community identity. The legacy of this divergence continued to influence subsequent religious, social, and cultural developments throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. Christianity, now organized with codified practices and trans-regional communities, laid the foundation for future theological development, expansion across the Mediterranean, and eventual recognition as a distinct religion by Roman authorities. Judaism, restructured around rabbinic leadership, codified law, and synagogue-centered worship, maintained continuity of first-century practice while adapting to the post-temple reality. Both traditions, while sharing common origins, followed historically verifiable paths that produced distinct identities by the close of the 1st century AD.